Through periods of what for the U.S. is extreme heat during growing season as well too. So we had very uneven production conditions within the United States and here in Mexico too for your corn crop. And I know that we're entering the next corn crop, which is largely irrigated, but you will note that it's still conditions are very dry and your reservoir levels within Mexico are perhaps below average. So again, some challenging growing conditions both in the United States and maybe within parts of Mexico. And so that's been a challenge for us through the growing season, and weather is always a factor in production. So now let's quickly run through some individual crops as well too. There seems to be okay, the slides here and up there are out of sync, so forgive me. I want to talk a little bit about individual commodities now then, and we'll go through some of the major commodities in livestock and talk a little bit about each of them. I will not spend a lot of time on rice, but I did mention to you we're seeing a lot of volatility in terms of rice prices. Rice prices are as high now as they were last time they were higher was 2007 during a major world food crisis. Okay? And I wanted to bring up rice because part of what we're seeing pushing rice prices higher is the fact that the Indians have put export controls on rice. So part of this, I understand that this is a food security issue for the Indians, but it also tells you that one has a regional responsibility in terms of export controls as well. You are simply transmitting your price volatility into the rest of the world or to those that are least able to adjust to those high prices, the most food insecure in the world. So again, I wanted to talk briefly about rice because the fact that we've seen rise in rice prices is really affecting those importing countries in Africa who are buying that rice and have seen their own import costs rise substantially. I want to, again, separate from what we're seeing between wheat and rice and corn and soybeans. So the rice I just showed you, global carry-out stocks declining. We're also seeing declining carry-out stocks in terms of wheat. Again, we're tightening the market in wheat over the next season as opposed to corn and soybeans, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But you can see production still a big number in terms of overall production. And when we look forward, it's important to note that part of the volatility that we're seeing in wheat prices is due to the fact that a fair amount of production of wheat comes out of the Black Sea. This is no surprise to you. This has been in the news a lot, but you can see that both Ukrainian and Russian wheat production is important in the global market. The Russians represent a huge share of global exports, maybe upwards of 25% of global trade. So anything which threatens the trade in food or fertilizer puts volatility into the marketplace. And I think that that is a risk that the wheat market is maintaining, at least some of that risk being that the war could expand. But also, let's not forget the effects of La Nina into an El Nino here. You can see the expectations in Australia, for instance, where the crop is below average after coming off of 3 years of very strong production, conducive from a La Nina, and now we're entering an El Nino. So production here potentially affected by changes in weather. So weather always has the last say. When we talk about global corn stocks here, we're going to talk about an expansion of both global corn stocks and global soybean stocks, and that's why I think the market is a bit more calm and relaxed, and there is less uncertainty and more expectation of moderating prices. In the United States, again, I showed you some pictures on our own yield conditions, weather conditions, heat, scattered drought, and you can see a below average yield. Still a decent yield, but by no means above trend. So a yield that was challenged by very uneven conditions across the country. But we still have a big crop in the United States. We still have a significant corn crop in the United States. And when you look at exporting countries around the world, and I told you that global carry-out stocks were going to increase, it is the United States which will carry a fair amount of those stocks. Okay? We see big crops of corn from Brazil, which seem to get bigger every year. It is the United States which will carry stocks this year. And when you look at this, we have seen the growth in exports and from South America. So here you can see growth in exports of both maize and soybeans, and you can see substantial growth in soybeans out of Brazil, and a rebound in production of Argentina. And when you add in Paraguay, that's more than 221 million metric tons of production next year, if under normal weather conditions. So again, we've got growing supplies out of South America for both corn and soybeans. And here is just to put that in context, where you had a couple of short crops in Argentina, some of that a contribution of La Nina. So a normal weather condition in South America would very much support a growth in global soybean supplies. So here, a large growth in what is inventories, final inventories, and the wild card, of course, will be Chinese needs to feed their swine herd. Chinese imports of beans, and again, an expectation that with a return to normal production in South America, that carry-out stocks will rise. In the United States here, too, our soybean crop was challenged by that very uneven weather also. So again, heat and moisture conditions varied substantially, and we ended up with a good soybean crop, but one with yields a little bit below trend. But one aspect of U.S. soybean production, I think, is when we think about changes in production in the United States, we have to look at the individual balance sheet in the United States and see where soybeans are going. And the one thing that I'll tell you here is, when you look at crush, when you look at the soybean crush number, you will see an increase. In the United States, our domestic crush industry is growing quite rapidly relative to recent years, and that is drawing domestic soybeans into the crush market, and the residual of production is what is then exported. When you look at this, that means that our crush industry in the United States is growing, and production swings is what swings exports in the United States. We've got a crush industry, again, which is showing significant growth after the last several years. And of course, this means two things. We're putting a lot more meal on the market in the U.S., soybean meal, and we're putting a lot more soybean oil onto the market. And what's driving that, importantly, is the crush margins are very strong. That's what's supporting overall growth in crush. Crush margins being very strong. Crush margin being taking the value of the bean and the value of the components and saying what's the profit for making that, for crushing those products. And you can see here that profitability of crush has been very high. But over the last several years in the United States, the value of the oil seed has been increasingly coming from the oil, not the meal. It used to be traditionally in the United States that it was the value of the meal as animal feed which drove the crush. We have seen, because of domestic policy in the United States, that it is the oil that has been driving the market. And as crush grows, we will increasingly need to find a home for more soybean and other oilseed meals to feed livestock. So for livestock, I think one important factor in the United States has been that we have seen for the second year in a row a decline in U.S. meat production. And when you look at this, you can see, well, 3 of the 4 categories of meat production are actually growing, but our cattle herd in the United States has contracted so much that it is offsetting those other gains and those other needs. We have seen now, again, 2 years in a row of a decline in overall U.S. meat production. Let's talk about swine a little bit first. Let's talk about swine production first. What I'm showing you here is the farrowing intentions, so the breeding intentions within the U.S. swine herd. Okay, breeding intentions reflecting the profitability of those producers. You can see that they are declines year over year, and this is a producer's response to what has been pretty poor margins for pork producers in the United States. So they have said, I will farrow less, I will breed fewer animals, and this will result in fewer pigs. And that makes sense in terms of if you are not making money, you will pull back on the number of bred animals. But what has happened in the United States is the number of pigs per litter has increased sharply over the last 2 quarters and offset any intention the producers had to farrow less. So production has not fallen. So while they are breeding fewer pigs, it is resulting in more piglets because of that jump in pigs per litter. So while they may intend to cut pork production, they have not done so because of their success in pigs per litter. Now, why does that matter? It means they're putting more swine on the market than they intend. They may like to pull back on the number of pigs, but they have not been successful in doing so because they've been successful in avoiding pig diseases. So part of what explains this strong jump in pigs per litter in the United States is this unusually low pressure on swine diseases in the United States. Okay? So the big question is, what is the future for pigs per litter? Is this a momentary bit of lower swine disease pressure? Do we see swine disease return to a more normal pattern? Does that mean a cut in pork production? Or do we continue to overshoot in terms of domestic pork production in the United States, even as producers try and pull back to gain profitability? So this is the situation here in the United States where that pigs per litter number, are those last 2 observations the new normal? Are we back on trend? Or is this something that's just momentary and we'll see a cut in production even on those reductions in fair rates? So let's talk about cattle a little bit in the United States as well too. This graph shows you the overlay of drought and cattle on feed. So it isn't a perfect overlap of where the cattle forage conditions are at, but this kind of tells you that there's a strong overlay between where our cattle are and where our conditions of drought are as well. There's a significant amount of overlap between those two. We have seen, again, the drought severely affect our forage production in the United States. That means that folks making decisions about overwintering cattle are having to make decisions of whether they can keep that cow-calf pair, overwinter them into the spring, and then send them off into the feedlot. Am I going to have sufficient forage conditions in order for those cattle to continue to be able to be sustained on the land? And we'll see our own forage production, while it is better this year, it is off a very poor year last year. Okay, so that means that despite what have been very high cattle prices, record high cattle and calf prices, producers in the United States have not been willing to retain heifers for breeding. They have been unwilling to do so because they are unsure of forage conditions. And even now we see heifers that they could be retaining for breeding, they are saying, prices are so good that I will send them to the feedlot because I can use the money now and I am unsure about the future conditions. So here, this shows you the cattle cycle that we've had, the last couple of cattle cycles in the United States. And we have a decline in our cattle cycle. We are in the contraction phase, and we have yet to see a turn in that cattle cycle. This has implications as well when one thinks about the balance between slaughter capacity in the United States and the number of cattle available. As the number of cattle available to slaughter slips below the capacity of the slaughter plants in the United States, that's why we're seeing such strength in calf and cattle prices. And that's why we're coming to Mexico for feeder cattle as well too. So you can see part of the draw is to pull additional cattle out of the Mexican market to put into feedlots to maintain that slaughter capacity in the United States, which wants to operate in a narrow range for efficiency purposes. And that's also why we think that prices in 2014 will exceed those in 2024 will exceed those in 2023. We have falling cattle numbers, pretty good demand for beef within the United States, and a slaughter capacity that can support more slaughter than we have now. So the packers are having to pay up now, versus 2 years ago, it was the other way around. And there were plenty of cattle relative to slaughter capacity. So I'll be looking for the turn in overall cattle production. Let's talk a little bit about trade as well too. And I'm going to talk about trade from the U.S. perspective, but we'll talk about trade between the U.S. and Mexico as well. What we've seen, again, during that period, the first slide I showed you was prices since 2020. I said prices had been rising. Part of the reason prices started to rise in 2020 because it was a return to trade in the U.S. A big jump in both imports and exports. And here we can see imports continue to be quite strong. Exports not quite as strong, but still a good amount of U.S. exports. But let's dig into the export side a little bit before we talk about the imports, so we can see one of the reasons why our export profile has been falling, the dollar value of our exports is falling, is the Chinese have pulled back from the U.S. market a little bit. They are still our #1 trading partner, and they were by far and away our #1 trading partner for a couple of years. They have pulled back a little bit as they also look to diversify sources of inputs. We can see them now buying Brazilian corn after solving the final phytosanitary issues with Brazilian corn, and we can see them diversifying on the meal side in terms of where they are bringing in meals or oilseeds for processing in the country. I think the other good side of this is regional trade with the U.S. between Mexico, Canada, and the United States has jumped up and remains strong. I think that that's a good thing. And here, this makes a lot of sense when you look at when you look at China being the source of our decline in the next 2 years on U.S. export value. It is based on oilseeds, both falling prices and falling volumes are the big explainer of this. Let's talk about imports a little bit. And I do not concern myself so much with the trade deficit in the U.S., where we are importing a bit more than we are exporting. As a small child in the middle of the country in the U.S. in the wintertime, you could not get very many different products. When I was a kid, your choice in the middle of winter, when it was very cold, was really limited. I think that's one of the great benefits of trade is now we grow certain products, our neighbors here in Mexico grow certain products, and I can now go to my hometown grocery store and see great products year-round and have a much better opportunity to buy different products. So when you look at import volumes, it matches that very much. We see an expectation of continued growth in imports by the United States of fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, some cases vegetable oil. Again, I went back to, I told you that oil was driving the U.S. oilseed crush, that the oil side was driving it. Because we are producing biodiesel products, it means we need more oil. then it also means an opportunity for those in poultry or swine who would like to feed meal. But you can see that it needs to import some additional vegetable oils. And then you can see down the line that imports of most major products growing into the next year. And when we look at where they're coming from in the United States, they're also coming from close to home. So strong growth in our trade here between our partners in Mexico and in Canada, and to a lesser extent, South America. But we're bringing in from this hemisphere a lot more products. So again, products that are counter-seasonal in the United States, and so that as someone in the Midwest in the wintertime, you can get a nice variety of products. So some concluding thoughts, grain prices have come down, but there remains risks within the U.S. market for several commodities. I see a very strong distinction in volatility between feed grains and food grains. And from a food security perspective, that does worry me. I continue to watch the food grain perspectives. I think also when one thinks about reliability and transparency is important among trading partners. I gave you the example about rice from India. India clearly has domestic food security concerns, and those are legitimate. But when they put export controls or they manage trade into the rest of the world, what they end up doing is forcing all of that uncertainty onto folks who can least able or are least able to handle it. So I think again, we need to watch for interventions in trade that can lead to increased uncertainty and instability. Input and output prices are narrowing margins. I think that we have producers here that would say, while fertilizer prices have come down, they're still not to where they were before the war in Ukraine. So I think that there are still stresses for U.S. producers on the relative decline in commodity prices, whereas input prices are more stubborn at the moment in where prices are headed, squeezing the margin from a very good year in 2022 to now here in 2023, a year which is still above average, but again, margins continue to narrow, the expectation is for continuing to fall commodity prices, and producers a bit anxious about what that means for their margins going forward. And then in terms of global and regional macroeconomic risks, again, I think that this is always one of the things we watch about. Part of the reason I think the U.S. is importing more than it's exporting is also because of a strong dollar. And so this is always a factor in our trade, and also how global demand forms under macro conditions around the world. And weather is always the deciding factor. We've had a drought in the U.S. which has been moving east. You have had dry conditions here in Mexico. We have seen a very strong El Nino emerging. These factors in agriculture, we are used to dealing with that uncertainty. This year will be no different. We will continue to deal with the uncertainties in weather, and they will add to whatever other uncertainties we see in the market. So, with that, I will conclude and thank you all and say that is what I'm looking at in terms of global agricultural markets, both in the United States, here in the region, and around the world. Thank you all.
Agradecemos la participación del economista jefe del Departamento de Agricultura de los Estados Unidos, Seth Meyer, por su excelente conferencia de apertura de este foro global agroalimentario, y le vamos a solicitar